Welcome back, AP, and welcome back to your last flip for AP Euro, right? Your last flip for your first AP class, the first AP class that all of you are going to crush, the first AP class that all of you did so well, the first class of AP kids that I ever have looked at and been like, every one of those kids is going to do great, right? And as I stand here in the shadow of one of the greatest projects I've ever seen in my career as a teacher, I think it's appropriate that we just dive right in, kick this thing's butt, and get after it. And ironically enough, your content will end with a Tom Ritchie video, right? But let's get after it, shall we? So we talked about the Cold War in the last week. We talked about spies, the Rosenbergs. We talked about the Marshall Plan. We talked about the superpowers rising up. We talked about a lot of different stuff, right? We talked about de-Stalinization under Khrushchev. We also talked about the building of the Berlin Wall, the division of Europe, right? The extension of the Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc, Warsaw Pact, NATO, talked about all that stuff, right? There was a couple of last little major events outside the hot wars that we talked about, which was the Korean War, the Vietnam War, things like that, and a couple of other major key events. To throw in there is like the Cuban Missile Crisis, right? The Cuban Missile Crisis was a huge thing. I talked about it a little bit in class the other day when I was talking about how Khrushchev is going to store a bunch of nuclear missiles inside of Cuba following Cuba's communist revolution that was supported directly by the Soviets. Because remember, the Soviets are all about growing their influence and trying to gobble up some of those third world countries that they think they can grab onto and turn them into a second world country, a communist controlled country, right? And so Fidel Castro agrees to allow Nikita Khrushchev to store nuclear armaments inside of Cuba. And why is that scary for the Americans? Because Cuba is only 90 miles off the coast of Florida, which means that Cuba would put them within nuclear ballistic striking distance of major targets inside of the United States. One of them actually might end up becoming a state. One of them was Washington, D.C. Now, also going forward, though, and they did this because the Americans had missiles stored in Turkey, which is very close to southern Russia, and it meant Russian targets would have been in range of those nuclear weapons, right? So this whole thing's going to end up coming down to a big blockade, a big standoff, and a very, very close roll-up to almost being a hot war from this Cold War between the United States and Russia, right? But what ends up happening is the United States moves their missiles out of Turkey, the Soviets move their missiles out of Cuba, and things going back to being very frosty, right? There was also the space race, right? Space race was discussed by Angelina Murphy in class as well. The Russians got Sputnik up there, and a dog, and a guy, and his name was Yuri Gaganovich, or Yuri Gaganovich. All right, so but they get that guy up there, and then the Russians and the U.S. enter into this space race where they're trying to see who can orbit the Earth first, America. Who can get to orbit the moon first, America. Who can step onto the moon first, America. So, the big thing, though, going forward, though, is the space race was big, and a lot of the space race stuff happened during the reign of this guy, right? So, following Nikita Khrushchev, you're going to see the rise of this guy named Brezhnev, right? And he's Leonid Brezhnev, right? So Leonid Brezhnev is going to be the leader of the Soviet Union during the latter half of the 1960s, most of the 1970s, and I believe... So Brezhnev is going to be the second to last leader, major premier of the Soviet Union. A couple other guys were kind of peppered in there between him and this guy named Mikhail Gorbachev. But Brezhnev was a big guy because he actually continued the de-Stalinization programs of Khrushchev, continued the destruction of the personality cult. However, he also adopts that Brezhnev doctrine that we started talking about in the last flip as well. Whereas the Truman doctrine was we will intervene to stop the spread of communism, the Brezhnev doctrine was we will intervene to stop the uprising of social or protest movements that go against our socialist understandings of the world. For example, Brezhnev was in power when the Prague Spring was put down, I believe. Brezhnev was in power whenever the quelling of the Chechenian crisis comes up. Actually, that might have been Gorbachev that was in charge of that one. All right, so now look. But the big thing about it, though, is while all this dissension and scary stuff is bubbling up in the East, you also had some major trends going on in Western Europe during this time period. And one of them includes second wave feminism, right? So I know some of you are let's go. Now look, so check this out though. So first wave feminism, if there's a second wave, there's got to be a first wave, right? So let's delineate the difference between first wave feminism and second wave feminism, right? First wave feminism focused on political rights and suffrage, right? It focused on the ideas behind It focused on the ideas that were put forward in World War I. It focused on the concepts of like, hey, we want suffrage. Hey, we want the right to vote. We believe that the rights to vote will actually grow a woman's influence in society, place female leaders in power, and will begin to lead to social and economic changes, right? And these things did happen in the sense of suffrage began to roll out through many countries, right? And the roots of the women's suffrage movement in the first wave goes all the way back to the late 1800s with the changing of the family, the more involved, like, woman that is now working a job and getting out of, like, this entire traditional role. And a lot of that is going to be because of the laboring women of the labor aristocracy and the lower classes, as well as lower middle class laboring women, right? Now, women's suffrage is going to catch on almost immediately after World War I. Britain's going to do it in 1917, sort of. Britain did it for women over 30, whereas men in Britain could vote at 21, which was really stupid. But still, the United States is going to do it in 1919. Germany and Austria are going to do it in 1918. And the rest of the West is going to follow, except for France. France didn't legalize women to vote until 1945. How weird is that? So, like, and also just like, oh, dude. Like, 30 years late? Come on now. Like, so now, anyway, but big thing, though, is that things didn't change. Things didn't change as much as the women wanted to, right? They didn't change as much as women were still heavily excluded from certain things. Economic and social status didn't change as much as they wanted it to with the adoption of voting. So second wave feminism comes out following World War II. That focuses on enhancing the political and social power of women. It focuses on the idea of creating a smaller gap in wage earning. It focuses on the idea of getting women involved in professions like law, academia, medicine, because many of them were still heavily excluded from those fields, right? And with second wave feminism, you're going to see some second wave feminist figures pop up, including Simone de Beauvoir, right? Simone de Beauvoir wrote a very famous book known as The Second Sex, right? She's kind of the opposite, or not the opposite, but she's the contemporary, the European contemporary, so like your Betty Friedan's, right? So who wrote The Feminine Mystique that you'll talk about next year in APUS. Now, the interesting thing, though, Simone de Beauvoir wrote in The Second Sex basically saying that women are the secondary sex as viewed by society. Women are being viewed as this like later sex, this lesser than, and things like that. And this book was considered a very, very eye-opening tone for a lot of people. So women began to stand up for their rights and try to insert themselves more into society and try to close those economic barriers, right? Well, no, to get rid of those economic barriers, right? And so you're going to see some major effects pop up in Western Europe following second wave feminism. You're going to see a rise in divorce rates because women are going to begin to choose to remove themselves from chaotic relationships, chaotic homes, and actually exit the home and also be able to be in power of their own identity. You're going to see a rise in birth control, right, where women are going to actually begin to start choosing when they want to have a family. You're also going to see a rise in female leaders that are going to start popping up. And one of those female leaders that a lot of second wave feminists led to is like Margaret Thatcher. Oh, sweet irony. All right, so now like the ironic part about the funny ironic part about like second wave feminism leading to the growth of female leaders is that this female leader was not liberal at all. So like you have to understand is that feminism was seen as a very liberalist idea. A second wave feminist would say, oh, we're trying to vote for the liberal side of the ticket. Usually most feminists would be considered on your left wing, whereas ironically enough, Margaret Thatcher is a right-wing politician, right? Thatcher was a conservative prime minister and a leader of the Conservative Party in Great Britain. For any of y'all that watch The Crown, she's a very, very big figure in some of the later seasons. And this is actually her with the Queen of England right there. But this is what she actually looked like in real life. She had a very raspy voice, and she talked like this. And she would give these intense press conferences saying that people needed to pull themselves up by their bootstraps and get after it and blah, 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 blah. And she also was considered the Iron Lady, is what a lot of people refer to her as, old Margaret Thatcher, right? So, and she was in charge from about 1979 to 1990, and it's just kind of an interesting juxtaposition to be like, hey, you're going to see the rise of female leaders, but one of the most prominent female leaders in European history was actually really conservative. And so now don't get that confused, though, okay? Don't get that too confused, but you are going to see also a rise in this idea of Thatcherism, right? And Thatcherism is going to kind of redefine what a conservative is in Western Europe, right, post-World War II. Conservatives are going to begin to look a lot different. Conservatives are going to begin to be more socially conservative, right, trying to stop the advance of divorce rates and like different ideas that second wave feminists had like put out there. They're going to try and provide like this idea of reinforcing the traditional family values and things like that. You're also going to see social conservatives under Thatcher become anti-labor union, right? There was this thing called the Winter of Discontent that actually occurred in the late 1970s and into the 1980s in Europe, where the privatization of some specific state-run sources is going to happen. For example, and what that is economic liberalism. Now, don't get this messed up. She was conservative, but believed in economic liberalism, right? So it's kind of like a libertarian kind of like construct in the word. She wasn't saying economic liberalism as be more liberal, economic liberalism as in certain state-run things like coal mining, water sources, postal services need to be privatized to create competition, to create more jobs and things like that, which actually it does have a lot of merits in economic understanding and things like that, actually, to be completely honest. Now, economic liberalism, though, is going to be a big Thatcherist idea. Anti-labor union, prevent them from being able to organize and slow down production. Social conservatism. But another big thing that pops up under Thatcherism is this idea of Euroscepticism. This idea of like being very critical of European integration, like, can the Brits trust the French? Do we have the same ideas? Can the Irish trust the British? Are we really truly independent, right? So like without Northern Ireland. Can we do these things together? So Thatcherism and the rise of this new kind of conservative that's actually kind of popping up in Western Europe post-World War II is going to be a very Eurosceptic thing. And you can actually see this, of course, recently with Brexit. We'll bring Brexit up again here in a minute. Now, self-determination, though, is another big thing as well, because it's going to lead to something very surprising, all right? So self-determination was the idea that created new countries following World War I. So going all the way back to our funny little like thing that happened today in class during our review game, when somebody, I think it was Malaya, buzzed in, she said, Treaty of Versailles and the League of Nations. Well, no, the League of Nations was established by, drum roll please, the 14 points that were issued by Woodrow Wilson, right? So Woodrow Wilson issues the 14 points, okay? And in the 14 points, he advocates for this idea called self-determination, right? Self-determination is the concept that if enough people of a certain ethnic class and a certain culture or a certain national identity get together and decide that they want their own country, they should be allowed to have that. So you're going to see self-determination grow post-World War I and even going into World War II with the creation of countries like Yugoslavia, Czechoslovakia, Poland, etc., right? But the ideas of self-determination then spread immediately to many of the colonies, right? For example, many colonials and many colonial people have been rebelling against European influence during World War II. One of the most famous figures is, of course, Mohandas Gandhi, right? Or Mahatma Gandhi. Now, Gandhi is a very interesting figure because he's very politically debated now. He like did certain things well, didn't do certain other things well, so we won't get too far or too deep into him. But the big thing, though, is that his peaceful retaliations against British intervention and British rule is going to be a very, very big thing that's going to kind of sway and really change the tides of these colonies and their autonomy. So many of these colonies, most colonies, if not all of them pretty much, began a process of decolonization, where most of these European countries like Great Britain and France and many other powers had to give their colonies back, right? They had to give them up. The British had to give back India. The British gave back a lot of their African colonies. West Africa becomes an independent area under the French, or because the French give those colonies up, right? And most of this was done peacefully. Most of those were all done peacefully. They're like, okay, you're free now. And they just like kind of like left. Like another big problem was caused in British Palestine whenever the British were like, all right, peace. And like this place called Palestine was established. But then after World War II, the country of Israel is going to be established within Palestine, which has now led to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And what I'm getting at is some of these decolonization movements were actually much more violent, right? Led to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, led to the Vietnam War because the French didn't want to let go of Vietnam, and then they finally get forced out at this battle called Dien Bien Phu in 1954. The Korean War, actually, when Japan left Korea, they was split in half, and North Korea became communist, much like communist China, and South Korea stayed capitalist. And so the Korean War is going to happen because nobody actually efficiently decolonized that area, right? So you're going to see the rise in some violence. Some colonies are going to be given up peacefully. Some are going to be a little bit more violent. Now, speaking of violence, all right, so speaking of violence, the big thing about decolonization, nationalism was also on another weird upswing during the post-World War II era. So going out of the 40s, going into the 50s, into the 60s, and the 70s, the 80s, and 90s, you're going to see nationalism have a really different rebirth, where some of these ethnic minorities are going to begin to demand some of their own autonomous states, right? So, for example, there's a lot of different ones. Like Ireland, for example. Ireland is going to see the rise and the creation of this thing called the IRA, which is the Irish Republican Army, right? Which is this kind of, dubbed by some as a terrorist organization, dubbed by some as a liberation front. They are going to demand that Northern Ireland be liberated from British control and become a part of the newly formed Ireland nation. They're going to use very, very drastic tactics, including improvised explosive devices, attacks on certain civilian groups, attacks on politicians, and it's going to lead to a lot of very chaotic things going on because these Irish people are like, we are an ethnic minority, and we are an Irish group, we deserve our Irish country, and Northern Ireland should be a part of us, right? Whereas even to this day, Northern Ireland is not, okay? So, but we also talked about this as home rule with the Ulster Pact and things like that going on before World War I. Now, this led to events like Bloody Sunday that occurred in Ireland, right? There was Bloody Sunday in Russia. There was also Bloody Sunday in Ireland. And the Bloody Sunday in Ireland happened in the late 1970s, I believe. So let me double check that so I don't sound like I'm speaking out of the left side of my face. Bloody Sunday, Ireland. 1972. Man, I thought it was 1979. Now, anyway, but in 1972, a lot of people showed up to protest imprisonment without cause, and the British forces are going to open fire on them, killing a number of civilians, right? So minorities in Yugoslavia are going to also begin to demand their autonomous states because there are groups like, for example, Bosnian Muslims that did not feel supported by the new Yugoslavic state, and that's going to lead to a very terrifying thing known as ethnic cleansing. So you saw a lot of anti-nationalist violence on people as well, and the country of Yugoslavia doesn't even exist anymore because in the 1990s it broke apart, right? So into the countries you now know of, Albania, Montenegro, Kosovo, Serbia, Bosnia, and Croatia, right? So now, also, you're going to see the Chechenian crisis, where the Chechenians, which are a mostly Muslim minority that existed in southern Russia, demanded to become autonomous and demanded to become a free country, but the Russians came in and suppressed that uprising with violence, right? So the demands of some of these ethnic minorities to have their own autonomous countries will be suppressed violently, and the big violent ones are, of course, Ireland, Yugoslavia, and Chechnya. Now, going forward also, though, in the background of all of this, you've also got the fall of communism, right? So communism has not been faring well since Brezhnev. Brezhnev's having a rough time. The big thing, though, is that the fall of communism coincides with a very important figure. It coincides with the election and appointment of the last premier, well, not technically the last premier, but like the last major premier of the USSR, Mikhail Gorbachev, right? Or Gorbachev. Gorbachev is how Reagan said it all the time. This is Mikhail Gorbachev, and it's always been a running joke that his birthmark looks like Russia. It kind of does, actually, if you zoom in a little bit. Like, this looks like the Siberian area of Russia, and looks like it's going back that way. Now, anyway, but Mikhail Gorbachev did a very, very large attempt to try and make Russia a more liberal and real-world leaning state, which led to the destruction of the Soviet Union. Now, the biggest thing about Mikhail Gorbachev is he is going to adopt three huge policies, right? One is called glasnost. The other is called perestroika, okay? Now, it's actually glasnost, but so like glasnost, perestroika, and the destruction of the Brezhnev doctrine, right? So when Mikhail Gorbachev comes in, he wants to create a USSR that exists more like a Western European country in the terms of transparency, in the terms of government organization, in the terms of freedom of speech, in the terms of being able to demand certain things from your government. So with glasnost, or glasnost, it's see-through, like glass. Basically what he wanted to do is he wanted to make the Russian government more observable, right? More observable by its people, so the people knew what was going on, and they knew exactly what was happening. For example, right now, you can go on the internet and Google government spending budgets, voting results, things like that, because we have a transparent government for the most part in the United States. And that's a see-through thing. That's what Mikhail Gorbachev wanted to establish, is a government that was open. And then also with perestroika, he wanted to create a new structure, right? Structure. He wanted to create a new structure that would integrate more capitalist ideas. He wanted to actually allow people to criticize their government and also restructure the government to have different houses and different voting practices, right? And he's also going to do away with the Brezhnev Doctrine. Now, really quickly, though, the Glasnost one, in coupling with Perestroika, led to a just absolute tearing down of the Russian government because so many people had so many things to say. You know what I mean? They were like, oh, this is ridiculous. We've been living under oppression, and this has been happening, and this has been happening, and you destroyed the Hungarian student revolt in 1956, and you crushed the Prague Spring movement. So periodicals begin to lash out at all these different ideas. And so, with that, with the criticism of the government and things like that, the Soviet Union begins to fall to pieces. One of the biggest evidence of this was the fall of this bad boy. This is a very, very famous quote from the President Ronald Reagan, and it went a little something like this.
Secretary Gorbachev, if you seek peace, if you seek prosperity for the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe, if you seek liberalization, come here to this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
Exactly, right? Because by doing away with the Brezhnev Doctrine was the thing that said, if any social liberation movement tries to pop up and go against the socialist ideas of the USSR, it will be crushed with force. Gorbachev did away with this. Since he did away with the ideas of crushing liberation movements by force, who is there to stop the Berlin Wall from getting ripped down, right? No one. That's who. So the Berlin Wall gets torn down by the German citizens on the eastern side of Germany, and Germany becomes a united area again. And with the destruction of this, basically what ends up happening is the Soviet Union is going to fall in 1991, and it's going to turn into the Democratic Russian Federation, right? Or the Russia you know of now. And, of course, being led by a president, and their current president is Vladimir Putin, right? So now a democratically elected president, Vladimir Putin. Sort of. All right, now, anyway, but all this craziness, though, the fall of the Soviet Union, the fall of all these different things, nationalist movements happening by ethnic minorities, Chechens, Bosnians, Irish IRA, all this other crazy stuff, second wave feminism, first wave feminism, Thatcherism, all this stuff's going on, which led to the formation of a peacekeeping organization known as the European Union. All right, so to try and establish major initiatives, the European countries got together and decided to create this organization known as the European Union. And the European Union decided, as a conglomeration of countries, to try and create a more conversive and dynamic European identity, right? To try and create a Europe that is more a systematic bloc rather than autonomous countries one by one, right? Now, they are going to do a lot of different things, right? So the major initiatives and reforms are going to include a singular currency with economic controls, right? A currency that is backed by a conglomerated idea to prevent things like hyperinflation, which led to World War II, right? They actually recently tried to bail out Greece when they were having an economic crisis, right? Free movement of peoples, no passport. That's right, okay? So if we one day, please, end up in Europe, we will have a passport that gets us into the European Union, but then we do not need to get our passport stamped when we move through the European Union, right? For example, I have my passport book, and I've got a lot of stamps from Dusseldorf, Germany, because they have a major airport there. But when I went from Germany to Italy, when I went from Germany to Hungary, I actually didn't have to get my passport book stamped because Hungary is inside the European Union. Even though, ironically enough, surprisingly enough, Hungary doesn't use the euro, which is kind of funny. Now, but also it created a European Parliament, kind of like a secondary UN that had a lawmaking board and lawmaking power. So it created this large conglomeration of states to try and prevent violence and outbursts and outcries and outlash and things like that during the 1990s. And this would be formed, I believe, in 1993. Formation of European Union. Let's go. Yep, European Union formed in 1993, November 1st. However, lurking in the background is still this big thing that was brought in under the Thatcherist conservatives, right? This Eurosceptic idea, right? Where people are going to be like, I don't know if I want to be lumped in with all them, right? So it's a very weird process, but it's kind of like the European Union is something that we're looking at. We're not really sure if it's going to hold on forever because events like Brexit happened when the British recently left the European Union over the amount of worth of a sterling pound, over immigration things, which we'll get to here in a second, things like that. And then the National Rally in France, which has become a mainstream movement to try and remove France from the European Union and to become more of a conservative establishment. Which is a lot of really weird things, but it's like where the European Union grew and was created, and it's not even 20 years, or it's not even 30 years old yet. You know what I mean? It's like the European Union's younger than me. All right, so the ideas of Euroscepticism are kind of growing right along with it. So it's important to kind of keep that in the back of your mind. And then last but not least, before I send you over that Tom Ritchie video, migration and immigration. So something you need to know is that in the late 1800s, there was a massive amount of immigration from Europe. Huge number of people left Europe and immigrated to places like South America. Massive amount of Italians left Italy, went to places like South America, Central America, and the United States following their unification movement in 1861. And so when they do this and why they do this is because of the division, economically speaking, between the rural southern Italy area and the prominent industrial northern sector of Italy. Many of them left and ran out and moved to places where they believed they would become more economically advantageous. You also had a lot of Irish people who left the UK following the potato famine and immigrated to the United States. Of course, this is the very stereotypical image of the immigrant family pointing towards the Statue of Liberty and their immigration movement to the United States. There's going to be a huge boom in immigration into the United States during the late 1800s, and European migrants are going to begin to seek new homes. 55 million people left Europe in the late 1800s leading up to World War I. It's something you need to store in the back of your mind because it's something we never went over, but it is a very, very prominent theme that happened in the late 1800s. But the modern era issue is not that immigration is going on, it's immigration. People are now coming in. Many European countries are experiencing a massive influx of immigrants from places like Syria, Africa, Asia, Asia Minor, and other areas like that. And so what's happening is Europe is having to decide country to country, along with these Eurosceptic ideas, along with the fact that they're now a giant European Union, of how they want to deal with them. Some countries have thrown their doors open. Many of these countries include places like Germany, for example. They're handling it very differently. Germany has thrown its doors open to Syrian refugees and people fleeing the Syrian conflict, which has led to some violent outcries from some of these Eurosceptics and some hardliners that believe that immigrants shouldn't be allowed into their countries, which is ridiculous. But now, anyway, so many countries choose to handle that differently. This added fuel to that Eurosceptic fire. And it's becoming a very, very, very debated issue going on in Europe to this day. And a lot of it includes refugees. How much are they like where they came from, and are they truly what our country is now, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Italy's experiencing a massive amount of African immigration. A lot of different areas are actually experiencing a lot of different things going on. But that is where we're going to stop, and I'm going to send you over to this Tom Ritchie video. All you need to do is watch the last couple of minutes. But hey, really quick, I just wanted to tell y'all that, one, I'm insanely proud of y'all. I am so excited that I got the chance to teach y'all. You are probably one of the most fantastic groups of students I've ever met. In the shadow of this amazing project, I think no matter what happens on Friday, no matter if you get a 3 or get a 2 or get a 5 or get a 4, it doesn't matter. Because you have learned so much and have tried so hard. And I know for a fact all of you have the ability to do anything. And that goes for beating that test. And it goes for just anything, period. Y'all are amazing kids. I have full confidence in all of y'all. If y'all need any more help leading it up to it, you know I'm here. Anytime, email me. Let me know. I'll be here for you next year to help you study for American if you need me to, okay? But the big thing is, get some confidence. I believe in y'all. I'm confident in y'all. And I know you're going to do great. So I'll see y'all soon. Y'all have a good one.